Welcome everybody to the Met Office organised seminar on adaptation, taking an evidence-based approach. Hayley, could we have the slides shared, please? Today we've got a number of speakers. We'll be looking at the issue of adaptation through two different routes. Firstly, we'll be taking a policy-focused view, and two of our speakers come very much from that angle. We'll then be looking at what adaptation means in practice. The presentations should take about 30 minutes. Then there's lots of opportunity for questions and hopefully answers and discussion. We've put on the screen our usual code of conduct. So we want everybody to benefit from this webinar. We want everybody to feel safe and enjoy the webinar. So all participants are invited to really help us create an harassment-free, inclusive, safe and positive experience. Thinking of adaptation, it's probably on many of our minds this week. We've seen the government launch the National Adaptation Plan #3. We'll be hearing about that in some of the talks and discussion. But also very visibly, we've seen the effects of climate extremes across the world. We've seen heat waves in the US, Europe and parts of Asia. In particular, we've seen the impact of those temperature extremes. And I think it's really brought home, certainly to me, the need to build resilience and adapt. And that the types of extreme event that we need to respond to, it's not something that's way off into the future. It's something that we're experiencing now. And so we need to build our resilience. Turning to our four speakers, if I could ask them to put on their cameras so we can see them. The first one will be Svenja Szyminski. Svenja has a number of different roles, working in the private sector at Marsh McLennan, sorry, got to get the name right, but also engaging in the academic sphere at Grantham LSE, and is a member of the Adaptation Committee. So she'll be able to give us several different perspectives. We've got Dan McCartney, who's head of adaptation at Defra, and he'll be giving us a government perspective and a role, and I think can tell us some exciting things about the National Adaptation Plan. Then we've got two practitioners can give us a very different view, I think. We've got Sam Bridgewater from Clinton Devon Estates, where he's Director of Environmental Strategy and Evidence. And we've got Murray Dale, someone I've had the pleasure of collaborating with on many occasions in the past. Murray is Group Technical Director at JBA. So with that, let's go into the first talk. And Svenja, over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Adaptation is a topic that I've been working on for a long time in different roles, academic, working with government and in the private sector. And I think it's been often described as the Cinderella of climate change. Not sure I really buy into this analogy, maybe more like Sleeping Beauty, now woken up by the growing risks, which is obviously not funny. So, you know, the question is, has it been woken up? I mean, is adaptation happening? And I guess that's what we're going to focus on today. So I'm really pleased that we set this up, that we have a session. So, you know, I'm going to share a few insights based on my role on the Committee on Climate Change, on the Adaptation Committee, but also then swing over to the private sector view, because I think it's also interesting to see, you know, what is the vision there, and I think how can we actually deliver adaptation. And just to begin with, you know, it's great to see more focus on adaptation, but the reasons are obviously not good. You know, we have a failure to reduce emissions quick enough, and also failure to manage risk. I mean, there are lots of issues related to climate adaptation that would even cause problems without the climate changing. So, you know, we just end up building the wrong stuff in the wrong places, to put it, you know, very simplistically. So I always use this as a starting point. You know, at the LSE, we did some research looking at global imbalance between risk reduction, adaptation, prevention efforts and recovery repair after an event. And I think that is a really sort of staggering imbalance. I think it's about 15% of global funds spent on disasters go into risk reduction prevention and 85% going into recovery repair. I mean, that alone, tells you a lot where things are going wrong. And, it's just not sustainable, definitely not helping with changing risk levels. So that's kind of the global picture. Where are we on this in the UK? And I'll share a few insights from the Committee on Climate Change. So on this slide here, you see, some of the headline findings from our progress report. So the Committee on Climate Change has a statutory duty to run a climate change risk assessment, which we are doing on a cycle every 5 years, but also to check on adaptation progress and report on that every 2 years. So the report that you see here is focused on the UK, and it has a lot of examples there. We're also having specific reports focusing on Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, given the devolved nature of a lot of the adaptation topics. So, the whole notion of evidence-based assessment of adaptation, that's basically the point of doing this adaptation progress report. So how do we do this? So we're actually trying to score adaptation progress across different areas, in total 14 areas. And we're looking at plans and also evidence of delivery. So anybody who's involved in adaptation work will know that, this is not as simple as just looking at one indicator or, running a bit of an, a survey and then you have the answer. No, this is really like I often describe it as a detective exercise. I mean, you really have to take into account quantitative and qualitative evidence, talk to stakeholders and do your own analysis. And that's what we're doing. And we're doing this regularly to also see over time how the country is doing. So you see here some of the, the headline findings there. And, the overall verdict is that there's inadequate progress, particularly with regards to delivery. And I'll say a few words on that in a minute. But, I think this is really important. I mean, there is definitely more consideration of climate change. It's better recognized. And I think there is more evidence of plans, and we also have more policies in place. But what we don't really see is the evidence of delivering. And then I think also the extent to what are these policies and plans credible. And here the last bullet, in our last assessment, we only found that for 5 of the adaptation outcomes that we were assessing, out of 45, we felt that the plans are credible. So, this is kind of, if we move to the next slide, I'll just give you a bit of a flavor of how, how we do this in the CCC and how this looks like. And we're doing this for 14 different areas. I think, what we find is really useful if you sort of draw the distinction between, you have the outer ring and the inner ring. So the inner ring of these sort of bullseyes are focused on plans and policies, and the outer ring looks at the implementation. And I think, in very simplistic terms, the more green and, the better, and the more sort of red, the more concerned we are. I think it's also important to know that the black sort of coloring here sort of really shows how difficult it often is to actually have good evidence and to actually come up with robust assessments. And I think not having evidence should not be equal with nothing is happening. So I think that's an important message. But it also, puts the onus, I guess, on all of us, to really make sure that we also track and record adaptation evidence. So if we move to the next slide, you'll see actually that, there's very little green. I think here the green example that you see here is with regards to flood risk and how it's considered in, with towns and cities, to what extent they are prepared and are sort of having plans and policies in place. But I think the key question for me is, this is obviously not a new topic, and we are sort of we've now seen the third National Adaptation Plan. We've done a couple of rounds of risk assessment. So you could argue that actually plans and policies should be all yellow and green, because, having a plan and a policy in place, that is, should be really the low-hanging fruit. Implementation and delivery, that is often very difficult. And I think the key challenge is also, this question of, by when and how much and who pays for it. But at least have a plan and a policy in place. I think that is really important. So, earlier this week, we saw the launch of the third National Adaptation Program. And, we're very positive on that. And there are lots of positive steps. But I think by and large, we are also quite concerned because, the progress is not good enough. And, we see this actually as, something that, it should be an evolving process. There should be much more focus on delivery and also on the funding and on the investment that comes with it. And on that last point with the investment and funding, if we just move to the last slides that I have here, I said we should be really in a phase where we're moving from plans and policies and assessing the risk and understanding the risk to delivering, adaptation. And that's something that I spend a lot of time on when I talk to private sector colleagues, and, exactly on what it is that you need to do to actually operationalize and deliver adaptation. And I think this notion of having a 360-degree of risk and looking at the different elements is really important. But it's also not just something that sort of sits with either policymakers or regulators or infrastructure owners. It's a really much broader piece where different things need to come together. And with that, the sort of last slide, which kind of sort of homes in that actually, given the challenge, given the level of risk that we see, given the pressure from risk abroad and at home, it really needs, bold action, cutting across policies, across also this notion of a risk culture where we actually understand what individuals do and what our vision, our resilience objectives are, all the way to, making this actually attractive for financial players to invest in. And then this sort of point on insurance, which is often seen as a tool to deliver and support adaptation, but it can also be seen as a barrier where people think, well, as long as we have insurance, we are safe. And now getting concerned that actually insurance might not be around for much longer on some of the risks. So it's a really sort of joint effort. And I think this is where adaptation, is complex, but at the same time has also been undersold. And I think there are significant opportunities for it. So I'm looking forward to hear from colleagues on where they are actually making progress in these different areas. With that, looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent, thank you. Over to Dan now for the second talk.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. As I've already been introduced, so I won't reintroduce myself, but there'll be some slides that come up on the screen. I can't see them yet. I'm hoping a Met Office colleague is going to do that. But I'll tell you what I'm going to cover. I'll probably give some context on climate impact, so I expect to skirt over that relatively quickly. Give you a bit of context on the framework within which my team operates as coordinating the work on climate adaptation across government. I'll then talk about and give you a pretty high level some overview on what is in the third National Adaptation Programme and a bit of overview on some of the risks that we are responding to. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Great stuff. So there's two slides here on context, and I think most people will be familiar with this, but heat waves, heavy rainfall and wildfires have been significantly experienced over recent years, and we'll all remember the 40-degree heat that we experienced last year, as well as various episodes of wildfires and extremely heavy rainfall. in recent years, which has increased and is expected to increase further as a result of climate change. Next slide, please. So if you like, so climate risks are happening. There are ongoing impacts on a day-to-day basis. There are, if you like, committed impacts that we expect to happen, even if as a global community we went to net zero tomorrow, and there is future warming, and you know, whether it's 1.5 degrees or more, will be in the system that we'll need to respond to. And you've got some numbers on this slide about the sorts of financial related impacts of 1.1% of GDP, currently up to 3.3 by 2050, and even as high as 7.4% by 2100. And the sort of value of acting on climate impacts and the cost benefit ratios there are very significant, from 1 to 2 to 1 to 10. In terms of spend versus benefit. So, you know, big ratios there that are really quite motivating to action. Yeah, can we go to the next slide, please? So to give you a bit of an idea of the sort of framework that we operate within, so the Climate Change Act 2008 established the framework for us. It established the 5-year cycle that we operate within. If you like, at the start of that cycle is a climate change risk assessment, followed usually in about 18 months by a NAP, a National Adaptation Programme. So that you can see the document there on the screen on the left, which is what we published on Monday night. Which responds to each of the risks identified in the risk assessment. And the Climate Change Act also established the adaptation reporting power, which enables government to ask for infrastructure providers, as well as companies with a public interest, to report on their preparations for managing climate risks. And in the NAP document, we included a strategy on the adaptation reporting power to set out how we'll use that power in this round of the kind of 5-year cycle. The CCA also established the Climate Change Committee, and you've heard from Svenja on their role and the recent report that they published on the adaptation progress report, which we will respond to as Defra in October, albeit some of the material in the NAP does respond to, and certainly some of the overarching objectives or challenges to government, which I'm certainly happy to cover later. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this just gives you, and you won't be able to read it, but it gives you a visual idea of the 61 risks that were in the climate change risk assessment. As Svenja said, the Climate Change Committee produced that report for government, and then government adopts it. That's split over 5 sectors, which I'll show on the next slide in a second. And what you can see here is if you like, the red boxes, or the red risks, are the ones that need most action. Blue requiring further investigation, and green are broadly being managed. So you can see there's quite a lot of work to do, and this is based on the formula and the assessment from the risk assessment, which has evolved in the Climate Change Committee's work into what Svenja was talking about before as 14, what we sometimes refer to as systems. So the NAP is responding to the CCRA, which is the 61 risks against 5 sectors. So it can be confusing. We are likely to evolve our approach to adopt the system approach, but the NAP is written on the basis of the risk assessment. So it's worth just explaining that. We can move to the next slide, please. I think I've got 2 more slides that I'll set out at a pretty high level, the approach and some of the sort of highlights from the NAP document itself. I mean, firstly, to say on ambition and focus, ministers have been very keen to ensure that we have a step change on adaptation and managing climate risks. Svenja mentioned adaptation being a sleeping giant, and I very much agree. I think we're in the process of waking that giant up, but it is a journey, and it starts with a vision. You've got a high-level vision here. And the UK government's vision for adaptation is for a country that effectively plans for and is fully adapted to the changing climate with resilience against each of the identified climate risks. And now this NAP identifies each and responds to each of the 61 climate risks. The previous NAP didn't do that. We feel that this is a definite move forward in terms of a comprehensive response to those climate risks. And if you look at the document, it's a big, we have some printed copies, and I was surprised at how thick it was. There's a lot of material in the annexes on each risk, and some of the risks are divided by infrastructure sectors. So there's a lot of material there on intentions of government to manage those risks, and wherever possible timescales for that. So it's a detailed read, and I'd urge everyone on the call, if they get a chance, to have a look through. The NAP has 3 themes within each of the sectors, which the next slide we'll get to, that identifies the action and really starts to move us in the sort of direction of delivery. Svenja mentioned about the sort of lack of perceptible delivery, you know, which we've accepted. Action sets out the sorts of actions that we will take to move delivery forward. But delivery needs also capacity building through information sharing and coordination. And there's a range of actions and commitments that relate to those 2 subsectors as well, and they go throughout the document. How we'll run the programme. So, I mean, it's really important to think of this NAP as a starting point. So it is effectively the start of a 5-year programme, which will be robustly managed by my team and across government, and the different teams across government that have responsibility for climate risks, 11 departments in total. So it's a 5-year programme which will be managed. There'll be a capacity building programme across government to ensure that we embed understanding and really drive actions. And one aspect of that is the supplementary guidance on adapting to climate change, which will be updated, which is a significant piece of work, and that is what departments use to guide decisions on spending. So it's fundamental and a key element, if you like, mainstreaming action on addressing climate impacts. We're establishing a new senior officials resilience board with Cabinet Office to oversee work on climate risks. We think that is really important. It might feel like a relatively minor thing, but actually in terms of how government coordinates action, it's fundamental. There are predecessor boards that have been doing similar functions, but this brings a lot of that into one place and really gives it the drive that it will need. And we'll be doing an extensive piece of work on monitoring and evaluation to develop new indicators on outcomes, which we'll be doing next year, which will really help to move our understanding of what success looks like on adaptation, which is, I would say, quite slippery, quite difficult to demonstrate. It's much easier to talk about process than actual outcomes. So there's an extensive piece of work there that will help to support our work going forward. If we go to the next slide, please. So I'm not going to read out all of these, but you've got the 5 sectors that are taken from, from the climate risk assessment. So infrastructure, natural environment, health, communities and built environment, business and industry, and for the first time, international dimensions in this NAP. So it's the first time that we've addressed international risks, for example, to supply chains that affect the UK. I mean, a few highlights in there. There's a range of existing commitments listed here, which have been corralled together against adaptation for the first time. which is, we think really important to have that in one place and to really have a think about the composite picture against these risks. But we've announced a new fund with the UK Research and Innovation to support innovation on how you deliver adaptive action. So we're really excited about that. That's a kind of new announcement and that we're further developing as we speak. We're also providing with Met Office support and material, a new offer to all upper tier local authorities to share climate projections and data so that they are equipped with information to be able to plan adaptation at the local level. And there's a range of other commitments. You've got some very high level elements here just sort of listed out for reference. There's an awful lot of additional detail in the NAP document itself. I won't get into it now because we haven't got time, but I would urge you all to have a look and get beyond if you can. It's a long document, I appreciate. Get beyond the exec summary. I'm going to stop there, but happy to take questions on any of the material I've talked about. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. And there's plenty of space for questions. We'll have those in one go across the full panel when we've heard the two short talks that we've still got to go. So I'm going to go straight into to Sam. Do you want to present your talk, please?
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Could I have the first slide, please? What I'm going to do, really, I've got about 4 minutes, so not very long. I'll fly through these slides, just give an overview of an adaptation, climate adaptation and habitat creation scheme in East Devon that the estate has been involved with in partnership with the Environment Agency, and share maybe some views on that. First slide, please. Is it just me or the slides not appearing?
The team are working on it just behind the scenes.
Fine.
So they should be there in a moment.
So just in terms of some financing, how has the project been financed? It's been financed in part by the estate. It's been financed in part by the Environment Agency, and the main driver for their interests is it can deliver compensatory habitat for flood defence works that are happening on the nearby estuary, and it's also been part financed by Europe through Interreg under the auspices of the Promoting Adaptation to Changing Coasts project. And Interreg were most interested in the learning that came out of this project, because there's about 70 estuaries on the south coast of England and the north coast of France that need to adapt, and these schemes aren't coming as quickly as they need to. So really it's just to try and share the learning about how you evaluate risk and how you actually progress a scheme like this. I'll just kind of crack on in the absence of slides. So the lower Otter Valley is heavily modified by human hand. It has the main modification was an embankment that was built in the early 19th century that canalised the river and disconnected the river from its entire floodplain. Since that time, there's been lots of other modifications, includes a cricket club, the lowest cricket club in England, in the floodplain. We also have a municipal dump in the middle of a floodplain. We also have a road that goes across the floodplain, and so on and so forth. And it's kind of existed like this for quite a while, but with climate change more intense. Here we go. Oh, it's gone again. Can you flick through? That's the Otter Valley. Flick through the slides, please. I'm conscious of time. That just shows the river as it was. That red line is the embankment that was built, the main modification. Next slide, please. And this shows you all the various modifications that we've got. There's an aqueduct that goes across the valley, and that blue line that kind of takes the Budley Brook across the valley, and that was put in to drain agriculture. But the big ones, again, the cricket club and the old tip. There was an old railway line, and historically what happens when it floods, the water gets trapped behind this infrastructure and can't get back out to sea, and there's only it can't join the river. Next slide, please. There's all sorts of problems that this is creating, and probably the most obvious one is the embankment is in danger of catastrophic breach. It almost breached in 2018, again in 2020. If it was to breach, the sea would come up the valley, and we know that the cricket club would be lost, the road would be tidal under 80% of all high tides, and a lot of infrastructure, including part of the Southwest Coast Path, would be compromised. We believe that in the absence of infinite amounts of public money, the sea is coming up the valley, and we want to sort of preemptively kind of manage that process. Next slide, please. In concept, what this means we've done is, or we're about to do, is to breach the embankment and allow the tide up the valley. And you get some pictures there of the cricket club as it is now at the top. What it might look at low tide, what it might look like high tide. Next slide, please. And so where we're at with this process, well, we've relocated the cricket ground already. We have moved and raised the road already. We have capped and protected the tip already, and we've dug the creek network in preparation for the breach that will be happening in the autumn. Next slide, please. And this is looking at the top of the valley. So where that kind of white area is, we've lowered an embankment down to floodplain level to connect the floodplain much better than it was. Next slide, please. And we put in a whole lot of visitor infrastructure, and we have also raised and improved a lot of the public access. So it is one of the busiest footpaths in Devon, let's say part of the Southwest Coast Path. Next slide, please. And just kind of shows the difference sort of as it was back in 2021, and in our preparation for the sea will come up the valley in a couple of months' time. Next slide, please. So in terms of observations, really, these things take quite a long time to deliver. So this has been 10 years in the making, I suppose. Even though there is a single willing landowner, and we were that landowner, we don't necessarily have land occupation, and it's quite hard to find new bits of land for things like a cricket club. If you want to find a new cricket club area close to Budley Salterton without enormous development potential, it is difficult. Likewise, a lot of these lands is connected up tied up in various lease tenancy and leases, and you have to kind of negotiate the release of the land. So it can be difficult. Next slide, please. What we have found is it is actually easier to adapt infrastructure than it is actually to adapt organisational and societal behaviours. In a sense, there are many, many different organisations that had something whose assets were at risk, whether it's the county council on the road or whether it was other enterprises or water companies. In fact, nobody's doing much, but if you try and preemptively do something, everybody kind of wants the moon on the stick, and nobody really wants to change how they operate. And that's what we found, is that I think it's very hard to change behaviours. People want to do the same things in the same way, and they want everything else to adapt, not themselves. Next slide, please. It's pretty hard with this scheme. So some of these schemes involve landscape scale change. In our case, that hasn't been seen in East Devon for probably several centuries. It is very difficult to bring society along with you. It's been a very bumpy ride, and we've tried to capture all the learning from this through the PACO project about how's the best way to engage with people and so on. Next slide, please. Another thing, it's very in our case, even though we were cited on all this stuff, and actually it's really, really hard to progress them. And there are lots and lots of constraints, including protected species, that make it much more difficult, much more it takes more time, it's more costly to deliver, and you have to obviously abide by that and so on. But it makes it very much difficult. When you want to work in a floodplain, basically is in the summer, and that's when everything wants to breed. Next slide, please. I think it might be my final one. Or maybe that was my final one. If it was, I will stop there, but happy to answer questions. I'm sorry that was such a fast run through our particular project.
Thanks, Sam. I think it's great to get this local view. It's really great to see some of the measures on the ground as well starting to be implemented. And I guess people can actually go out and see the adaptations in place and hopefully feel the benefit. We'll pick up the questions after the fourth speaker. So Murray, over to you for your 4 minutes. At the moment, we haven't got your sound.
Thank you, Jason. Sorry for the maybe if it's possible to mute your line. I'm in a meeting room with others in the Met Office, so just need to. That's great. Thank you. Sorry, we've got an audio issue here, which is just being resolved. Okay. Can you mute your machine? Okay, I'll keep talking. The JBA is a relatively small consultancy with about 700 staff, so you're welcome to find out things about us on the website. I'll move on. I'm going to talk about 2 examples related to adaptation and how we've been able to pull through climate change projections, including those produced by the Met Office, into actual understanding of risk and how you might adapt to that. So one example is topical at the moment with the problem concerning pollution in rivers and also sewer flooding and flooding of urban areas. So this has a lot to do with rainfall intensity and the projections of that changing in time. What we've been able to do is make use of one of the most superb pieces of research I think that's happened in the last 10 years, which is the production of a convective permitting model for the whole of the UK, run with 12 different ensemble members. So what that means is we've now got a really quite good handle on uncertainty related to very high resolution rainfall projections. We appreciate this is just for the RCP 8.5, the higher scenario, but the way things are tracking at the moment, that doesn't seem so unrealistic. So that's been an excellent piece of research to produce that. And to cut a long story short, we've been using this data for a number of years, and most recently a project for UK water industry research, or UCWIR, has enabled us to develop a tool that can change historic rainfall into a future estimated time series of rainfall. So what you're seeing here is a year's worth of data. You can perturb up to 20 or 30 years or however long you want. So if you feed in some historic rainfall measurements, we've made a tool that will enable you to increase some of the events within that and also represent future changes in things like drought and dry days. So it's not just rainfall intensity that increases, but there are subtle changes within the rainfall as well through the year. Now, this is really important for water companies who use these data for putting into into sewer models, and they determine the amount of spills through manholes and through combined sewer overflows, and they can therefore get a much better understanding on what will happen in the future based on these much more high resolution tools than have been available in the past. Now, someone I notice has put a question in the chat about how this leads to adaptation. Well, that would take a long time, a lot more than 4 minutes to talk about that. But in broad sense, there have been 2 types of adaptation which can be applied: adaptive or managed adaptive approaches, which are biting off a small amount of the risk as you go along, often with upstream things. So in this case, a sort of improved drainage. But then if you want to do something much bigger and bite off a large amount of the risk, so therefore reduce the risk enormously, it might be through an extremely costly thing like replacing a sewer and upsizing that sewer. Very disruptive, of course, when this happens in a city, extremely costly. And can things be done more adaptively on the left-hand side to mean that those precautionary decisions can be put off in time? This isn't new because this has been around for quite a while, and in October 2006 there was information about how people should adapt for flood risk produced by Defra, And so this graph just shows the bottom dashed line about the precautionary approach. You zoom the risk down straight away by a big investment, but then the risk creeps up over time. Or if you can do managed adaptive approaches, you can have this sawtooth blue line that reduces risk in little chunks, if you like, and can be a lot more cost effective and have a number of other sort of environmental and societal benefits. So there's lots of options for adaptation, and there's lots of good and less good practice around. If we want to look abroad, because I think it's important that we don't just consider adaptation in the UK, there's examples of the things that we've been involved in how other countries can adapt to the risks they're facing. And in a very poor country, Niger in Africa, West Africa, they've been hit by enormous floods in the last few years, but also have significant problems with water resource management in drier periods. So there we've been able to make use of climate projections that are available through the World Bank's Climate Change Knowledge Portal, which is a very useful resource that gives us information over time on future projections. And so this can inform the flood models that we produce for urban areas in Niger. And lastly, the types of adaptation measures that are appropriate there are, again, precautionary and adaptive, if you like. So there are things that can be done to manage water and reduce flows in the catchments. And there are also hard defences that need to be built. And to decide how high to build those requires information about how high those floods are likely to get, both now and in the future. So I'll stop there to allow some time for questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Murray. So we've got lots of questions coming in, some in the Q&A, some in the chat. We'll see how many we can get through. So I'd invite the speakers to turn their cameras on again. Great. And I think the first question we'll take, it's from Neil. What appear to be the key barriers to the production of plans and policies and associated delivery and implementation? Is it cost, skills, staffing, resource, prioritization, etc.? Svenja, do you want to have a go first from a more of a policy perspective and an industry perspective, and then perhaps we can get a community view from Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key observation is that adaptation is often, or has often been seen as a standalone issue rather than integrating it into, policies. And I think this is now slowly starting to change, but I think we've missed quite a lot of time and years. So what I mean by that is when we have policies that look at, health, that look at traffic, that look at infrastructure planning, that look at net zero, we have a lot of policies going on, but adaptation and whether or not these policies are actually, making risk worse or contributing to resilience, that's not really the mindset that we've been using. So I think that's a key barrier. And, I think this is, some people call it like the mainstreaming of adaptation or the integration of adaptation. So I think that would bring us, quite a big step forward if that would be the case. And it would avoid actually, doing stuff that we know will lead to, higher costs. And I mean, the classic example of building stuff that we know is, not fit for purpose going forward.
Thanks. And Sam, do you want to give a view from implementation and community level?
I guess from a community level, I think the earlier you engage, obviously, the better, making sure that this way that's done is honest and there's a sort of legitimacy to that process. One thing that we found that it's some of these things can be perceived as being imposed from an external body on a community, and I think you really want to try and kind of co-create it if you can. So that's kind of where I think, broadly speaking, where we're at now with it.
Okay, great. I'm going to take one from the chat now from Jonathan. I I think in this one, maybe Dan could have a go first, and then Murray, you could give a perspective on this one. So can you provide more details as to what is being planned in relation to resilience frameworks and standards for infrastructure? Will this build on existing frameworks and standards, e.g. ISO standards? Dan, if you want to take that from a policy and regulator, and then Murray, if you take that from somebody who's having to A, contribute to standards, and B, apply standards, that'd be really good.
Sure. I mean, in terms of resilience standards, so the resilience framework, which was published earlier this year, set out a commitment to look at resilience standards across the piece, and in principle, look at where there are gaps. Now, there aren't necessarily gaps everywhere. There's quite a lot of resilience standards across the different industries. It informs, you know, regulation of privatized industries, etc. But there is a commitment there to look at where there are gaps. It's not exclusively referring to climate resilience. So the resilience in the broader picture is part of that commitment. But you might see, for example, some areas on climate resilience that, you know, there may be some gaps as things evolve. I mean, data centers, telecoms, some of these sorts of areas could be, you know, could have potential for looking at whether we've quite got all of the right standards in place there. So I think they're the sorts of areas that are in the planning.
Great. And Murray?
Well, maybe you've asked me to speak, Jason, because we developed standards for people developing climate services. So there are now a set of standards, or at least we've turned them guidance as well, because they have a range of clauses to do with that say you should do some things and you should consider other things. So there are ways now for people developing climate services, which are often related to adaptation, to make sure these are of good quality, to make sure they are well understood, and crucially that they work with the users of the people who need the information as well as those who are providing them. So if there's a group providing a climate service that decisions are being taken on, that needs to be developed in cooperation as much as possible, even designed right from the start with the groups who are benefiting from those services. So this is what we call co-design and co-development.
Do you feel we're implementing co-development, co-design, co-production effectively around adaptation, all the way down to community level and all the way up to government level and everywhere in between at the moment? That's a question for anyone who wants to take it.
Well, I'm happy to have a quick go. I mean, I think there are great examples where it happened, but it's not really the norm, I think. And one issue that is often missing is also what is our vision and what's the goal? I mean, that's, you know, we haven't really talked that much about it. You know, what actually does a well-adapted UK mean? And I know the Committee on Climate Change has been very critical and has said, look, government comes up with a nice vision, but we can't really measure that. And what we need to do, I think, is to underpin that idea of we want to have a well-adapted UK with something that becomes meaningful, also all the way down to communities, but also for businesses. I mean, I talk a lot to investors and they say, well, what does it mean? You know, how can I actually track that my investment helps to deliver that, and will I get actually a return from that? So yeah, I think that's an important part.
Great. Sam, does it look the same from your perspective as well? What does co-development really mean?
I think from our side, it does mean from an early stage is really understanding of the problems that we perceive, I guess, as the landowner and our interests, and there's the problems that the EA perceive from their perspective, and likewise from the council and South West Water and so on. But you really, from our, you know, we're a fairly sort of small scale project, I suppose, but it means sitting down, you know, with the stakeholder group very early and actually trying to find out what are the problems that the community perceive, because they may not be the same. And then you can work it through and hopefully come up with this sort of co-creation idea. It works a lot better. And I think the other thing we had to cover, there were some quite kind of thorny issues you have to cover, because there is this expectation, I suppose, certainly in our area, that somebody, as yet unidentified, would be forever basically sorting the problems out. You know, somebody would be coming in and building that embankment higher and higher and higher. And it's not going to be the EA, because it's not really, hasn't got really so much sort of, in terms of it's not really protecting properties. It's not going to be the landowner. It's not going to be the council, who is, if there's a public rights right on top of it. And I think that you have to sort of try and tease these things out.
Great, thank you. Several of you mentioned the idea of adaptation indicators, and there's a question in the chat from Colin. Can you say more about the adaptation indicators, and how we can get to the point where we really do understand what effective adaptation looks like? So what works and maybe what doesn't? What are the options for making rapid progress in that? Who'd like to have a go at that one? Dan, maybe.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I disown Svenja's point earlier about kind of vision and having a really clear idea of where we're getting to. We have a high level vision in the NAP, but this issue about how do you actually articulate in a meaningful way what the outcome that you're looking for, and then how do you measure it, is not straightforward. Across the range of different climate impacts, it's an incredibly complex task to actually set that out and be able to measure it. Now, I mentioned briefly before, there's probably not an enormous amount more I can say about it, apart from that we have a commitment to produce a monitoring and evaluation framework that should be a piece of work that happens from now until next year. Our aim is to set out indicators against climate risks that show us, as far as we can in outcome terms, what success looks like. You know, for those of you that have leafed through or got to it yet, the annex to the NAP includes a risk reduction goal, which we worked across government to produce. They are not all outcome measures at this stage. That's a work in progress, but there's a definite commitment to invest significant time and effort in, you know, in research capacity, in trying to underpin and ensure that we've got a better idea on outcomes and how we measure. I agree with Svenja, you know, ideally we will work towards supplementing the vision and the ultimate goal. We are where we are now, but there is a 5-year programme, so we've got plenty of opportunities to sort of further develop that. So watch this space, I suppose. I've got there.
Great, thanks, Dan.
So Jason,
yeah,
from our scheme, it's just worth, I mean, we have a belief that it's going to do a lot of good things, and so what we have done, as you would expect, is a whole lot of baseline surveys, both on the environment but also on socioeconomic kind of factors. So we've captured that at the beginning, and then, you know, we'll be doing that after 5 years and 10 years, and then everything from property prices to health and well-being, people's enjoyment of the site, the costs of various authorities in managing their assets. And, you know, I guess the scheme eventually will be judged accordingly on the basis of those follow-up surveys in time. So I think it's quite easy to do these things for local schemes.
Thank you. Okay, we're running out of time. It goes so quickly in these events. There's just time really for each of you to give one remark, something that maybe you've been burning to say, having seen the questions, or you didn't get into your talk. Let's start with Murray on this one.
Okay, thanks. I think, Dan, you mentioned the 15 million programme of research coming up. I would just strongly urge that does encourage co-design and development of services, so that we, in the next tranche of research, do bring in those who are going to be the end beneficiaries of these adaptation and resilience research.
Thank you. Svenja, do you want to go second?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really all about delivering adaptation now. I mean, you know, we should be far ahead on this. And I think now, you know, the urgency, I mean, we're calling it, you know, the urgency, also the costing. I mean, we have a lot of reasons why we need to take action now. But we also still sell climate change as something that is, a gradual process, and we'll sort of communicate it often as if it was a linear thing that will only really get worse, like by 2050 or so. We really, you just experience it now. We live with climate change. So I think that argument, and I often see this where people say this is about the future. Well, it is also about today. I mean, we're not resilient to today's risk. So I think that will then create also lots of opportunities, because it deals with today's challenges and with someone's issues with supply chain today, not just in the future. And I think that should make it more tractable to people.
Thanks. I must admit that point of focusing on the present as well as the future is probably the biggest signal we've been getting back from a survey we carried out recently around UKCP users. So we're hearing that from so many different angles. Sam.
I think adaptation is in our experience is difficult, but I think it's essential, is definitely worthwhile, and I think you just have to start the process and don't be afraid of starting it. And I think I can't remember exactly what the quote was, and I heard at some climate change meeting a while back, it was like the hardest thing is to start, and the rest is just tenacity. And
Dan.
Thank you. I was going to say that the hardest step is the first one. Was it Mao Zedong? Possibly it's along similar lines. I think we've definitely taken the first step. I mean, I guess I'm just a personal reflection. I'm really excited, and I know my team are, of getting cracking on this. We've spent quite a lot of time in corralling departments and where they're up to. We're now in a phase of really pushing ahead. So what you see in the NAP document is a starting point. It's the point I made earlier, but I want to emphasize it. There's a lot more we're planning. A lot of that's indicated in NAP. There's more to come. There'll be a response to the Climate Change Committee's progress report in October. We expect to have more to say at that stage. There was a couple of questions about the local government offer. We're hoping to do that as soon as possible. I haven't got a date for anyone, but we're really keen to have that rolled out as quickly as possible, working with Met Office colleagues. It will be dedicated, it will allow for dedicated geography-based projections that will really help to sort of avoid the generalisation of regional or whatever. And so we really think that will help locally, just picking up on those specific questions. Thanks.
And there was a very specific one. How does it relate to UKCP 18? It includes UKCP 18 data as well as data from other sources, and the users will be able to upload their own relevant data, so they can mash it together with the climate projections. Excellent. Thanks everybody. Those were great talks. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. I guess I just want to also say, I think the talks have really illustrated that we're moving from simply defining the challenge to actually starting to find solutions. I think when we think of risk as a whole, we do need to consider adaptation alongside our mitigation efforts. And we also need to think about the co-benefits of both mitigation and adaptation options, so into a package of risk and benefit management. Thank you for joining us. We'll have another webinar coming up in the near future. Thank you very much.